Yeah, I just want to give an update. This book by Mihael Tisserand, Krazy, George Herriman. Um, Basically, his foundation coming from New Orleans, that mixture of language, Creole, slang, people from Germany, France, Haiti, um, some people that barely could speak, just freeing themselves, people being raised by people that are from different lands and mixing their languages. There was an identity that they had and sense of identity in New Orleans where you could just either pull yourself off as a mulatto or white person or African American. And George Herriman, A Life in Black and White, after his parents bailed after the Civil War, New Orleans became pretty crazy. It was less segregated before the Civil War than after. His parents bailed around 10 years after George Herriman was born, 1890. Went to LA, went to some Catholic school where it was a mix of like Mexicans, Americans, more immigrants. He learned Shakespeare, he learned Greek and Latin, he learned French, Spanish. I know at least those two other languages. He learned some public debate, public speaking, um, studied other philosophers and writers, poets, and he incorporated different types of languages, slang with idioms from expressions from Greek and Latin. He instilled a sense of like irony, depth into his sequential stories and caricatures and one-off cartoons. This is George Herriman. He fell in love with the Southwest and there he is. Right there. He learned about politics, and it says here, although his grandfather and father had both been politically active in New Orleans, George Herriman, perhaps after learning how it had turned out for his family, steered clear of politics. He didn't really take a side. He would do cartoons, anything that would influence somebody's thought on whether to have like a water reservoir built or not for a certain newspaper, depending on, I guess, who's paying off the newspaper. Elections. The newspaper that he was working for, when he went back to LA, he married his childhood sweetheart back in LA. He couldn't work for William Randolph Hearst paper when he went to New York City. He went back to LA. They said no way. The Examiner is this paper that William Randolph Hearst inherited and expanded it to LA and New York. It was originally from San Francisco. And Hearst, his paper, basically, my point is that when George Herriman was working for the Times in LA, around 1910, I think. At this point, he's around 30 years old. He couldn't get a job with Hearst paper, and then when him and his fellow cartoonist Carr, they went to this area called New Main Street, Hobo Corner. This guy, Vines, not sure his name, but he was trying to help this Sheriff William White get reelected. And he was saying, we are out to win. It doesn't matter how. And he offered Carr and Herriman to take these bribes to vote under false names for White to fix the vote. And they, said they'd go through with it, notified the authorities. And this is where things get interesting, because eventually the paper that William Randolph Hearst owned, the Examiner, suddenly hires George Herriman. They're witnesses. They're the leverage for this one other case for Sheriff White to get reelected. That Vignes guy is on trial. So he's sent to Santa Cruz, to make a long story short, by the Examiner. William Randolph Hearst suddenly decides to hire George Herriman. And when he's supposed to appear in court, they send him to Santa Cruz. George Herriman ends up paying a $50 fine. and just saying how he would rather pay the fine for contempt than eat Sheriff White's meals, some joke that was going on. He eventually did appear in court, and basically, the article that Carr wrote about the election, the bribes, um, it said that it was a trifle uncertain. And when Herriman took the stands, he says, "I do not think that is the man who offered me the bribe." And then he said that the guy who offered him the bribe, he thinks was a bigger man. So ultimately, it said it took the jury less than 9 minutes to come to a decision to acquit this guy, Vines. And yeah, they said that a lot of the decision was based on Herriman's testimony that all of a sudden he says he doesn't recognize that guy. So, to make a long story short, it says the timing of Herriman's return to the Hearst paper, because he had done some work for Hearst paper right after he graduated from high school, just some advertisements for some hotels before he went to New York City. George Herriman's employment has returned to Hearst paper. The timing of Herriman's return to Hearst paper, plus the cartoonist's sudden out-of-town assignment during the Vines trial, make it fairly clear that the vote-buying scheme played at least some part in Herriman's rehiring. Herriman and Carr would remain lifelong friends, even though they now worked for rival newspapers. Meanwhile, over the next few years, the inventiveness, the beauty, and sheer volume of Herriman's work for the Examiner would be more than enough to make anyone forget any politics, any political shenanigans that helped land him his job there. So basically, he worked for Hearst for the rest of his life. He was never unemployed. I just thought that was an interesting thing to note. Getting into this book, one last thing I wanted to mention. They called him George the Greek. People couldn't... So one of those things back then, you don't ask, don't tell. If somebody got caught hiding that they had African American descent, they could lose their job, and to say the least. And people kind of joke about how they weren't sure what George Herriman's ethnicity was. He would always, back then we're talking there was no internet, and when people would go to new towns, they could reinvent themselves. And George Herriman, I think he registered himself as a Caucasian when he was in New York after he left LA and when he came back. Ultimately, they called him the Greek because he was mixed, and it was a take off of like boxers back then. One of them called himself Abdo the Turk. So it was basically a rip on popular boxer nicknames. And yeah, they joked around like that, but yeah, this is somebody describing his hair as kinky, roofed, scrapper. Kinky was also the names given to newspapers. Black elevator operator. And ultimately, I don't know, they were saying something here about how people would just try and guess and joke around on his background, and it was like a don't ask, don't tell type of thing. George Herriman's, the influence of his education when he was at that Catholic school in L.A. Growing up for his high school years. I think he graduated when he was 16. Just, that mix of Shakespeare and the sense of irony and metaphors and the sense of identity. He would always kind of point that out in his cartoons. They would always have some type of metaphor, some type of play on words, or some kind of social commentary Herriman would play around with, while at the same time somebody like Walt Disney, he would anthropomorphize his characters more as just fun gags. Apparently, Herriman was a little bit more deeper. Herriman's works, this Krazy Kat, had its own cartoon. It would be played during intermissions or before movies. He had a float in Thanksgiving Day parades. This cat is pretty famous in the USA, and here's somebody that I keep hearing about that I really don't know anything about. One of the founders of sequential storytelling here in the United States. Real quick, happy Halloween. This is a horror comic, Kazuo Umezu, but if you really want to hear a name of a good horror artist from Japan, Junjito Ito. Halloween Comic Fest 2019. Just wanted to show you this really quick. These people are kind of just stuck in the middle of nowhere in this school. They have no idea. The phone doesn't work. They can't get anything on the TV. They have no idea why. It's kind of like a Twilight Zone type situation. It kind of starts off in the middle of it. This guy's trying a shortwave radio. You know, no one's broadcasting any emergency signal. There's nothing. This woman just collapses. And outside there's nothing all of a sudden. Something fun that's free. 2019 Halloween Comic Fest. Posters. Milligan and Allred's X-Force. I got this hardcover, first print. It's their run from like issue 116 to 129. It's just like these mutant groups that were sort of like a superhero team.